Solomon's story begins amidst divine promises and royal family drama in the palace of Jerusalem. The son of King David and Bathsheba, Solomon was neither the firstborn nor the obvious heir to the throne of Israel. But God had special plans for this boy. While David's older sons were caught up in conspiracies and power struggles, young Solomon grew up in the shadow of the great king. In 1 Chronicles 22:9, we read that his name, meaning peaceful, was chosen because God had promised David, "Behold, a son will be born to you who will be a man of peace. I will give him rest from all his enemies on every side. His name will be Solomon, and I will grant Israel peace and quiet during his reign." This is the story of how an unlikely young man became the wisest and richest king Israel had ever known, leading the nation into its golden age. It all began with a grave mistake. Instead of leading his armies into battle, as was customary, King David stayed behind in Jerusalem. One afternoon, as he walked on the rooftop of his palace, he saw a beautiful woman bathing. In 2 Samuel 11:3-4, we read, David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. From this forbidden relationship, a child was born but died shortly after birth as a consequence of David's sin. Deeply remorseful, David expressed his sorrow in Psalm 51. After this painful episode, 2 Samuel 12:24-25 tells us, "Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba, and he went to her and lay with her. She gave birth to a son, and they named him Solomon. The Lord loved him, and because the Lord loved him, he sent word through the prophet Nathan to name him Jedidiah, which means loved by the Lord." Though born from a union initially marked by sin, Solomon entered the world under divine favor. God had great plans for him, plans he had already revealed to David before the boy was even born. In 1 Chronicles 22:8-10, David tells Solomon, "But the word of the Lord came to me, you have shed much blood and have fought many wars. You are not to build a house for my name, because you have shed much blood on the earth in my sight. But you will have a son, who will be a man of peace and rest. I will give him rest from all his enemies on every side. His name will be Solomon, and I will grant Israel peace and quiet during his reign. He is the one who will build a house for my name. He will be my son, and I will be his father, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom over Israel forever." This was a great promise. Solomon would be the one to build the temple, something David had longed to do but couldn't because he had been a man of war. Even more than that, God would have a special relationship with Solomon, calling him his son. As Solomon grew up, his older half-brothers caused turmoil in the kingdom. Amnon, the firstborn, was killed by his brother Absalom after assaulting Absalom's sister Tamar. Later, Absalom himself tried to usurp the throne, rising against his father in a coup that ended with his own death. With them out of the way, Adonijah, another of David's older sons, believed he was next in line. 1 Kings 1:5-6 reveals, "Now Adonijah, whose mother was Haggith, put himself forward and said, 'I will be king.' So he got chariots and horses ready, with 50 men to run ahead of him. His father had never rebuked him by asking, 'Why do you behave as you do?' He was also very handsome. Adonijah began acting as though he were already king, without waiting for David's decision or divine confirmation. He knew David had promised the throne to Solomon, but he relied on the support of key figures like Joab, the army commander, and Abiathar, one of the priests. Adonijah's plan seemed to be working. With David old and frail, he threw a lavish banquet for his supporters, inviting all his brothers, except Solomon, and all the important men of Judah, except those loyal to Solomon. In his mind, it was all settled. He would be the next king of Israel. But while Adonijah was celebrating his self-coronation, God was working to ensure his plan would prevail. The prophet Nathan, who had often been God's voice to David, learned of the plot. He quickly approached Bathsheba and advised her on what to do. In 1 Kings 1:11-14, we read, "Then Nathan said to Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, 'Have you not heard that Adonijah, the son of Haggith, has become king, and our Lord David knows nothing about it? Now then, let me advise you how you can save your own life and the life of your son Solomon. Go into King David and say to him, My lord the king, did you not swear to me your servant, surely Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne? Why then has Adonijah become king? While you are still talking to the king, I will come in and add my word to what you have said." The plan was perfect. Bathsheba would go in first to remind David of his promise, and then Nathan would enter, unaware of the previous conversation, to confirm the news about Adonijah. The strategy worked. When Bathsheba bowed before the aged king, he asked what she wanted. She reminded him of his oath that Solomon would be king and informed him of Adonijah's banquet and his claim to the throne. While she was still speaking, Nathan arrived as planned and confirmed everything. David didn't hesitate. He immediately reaffirmed his decision to make Solomon king. In 1 Kings 1:29-30, David declared, "As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble, I will surely carry out this very day what I swore to you by the Lord, the God of Israel. Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne in my place." Time was of the essence. David summoned Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah, one of his most loyal officers, and gave them precise instructions. 1 Kings 1:33-35 records, "Take your Lord's servants with you, and have Solomon my son mount my own mule, and take him down to Gihon. There have Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint him king over Israel. Blow the trumpet and shout, 'Long live King Solomon!' Then you are to go up with him, and he is to come and sit on my throne and reign in my place. I have appointed him ruler over Israel and Judah." Everything happened just as David had commanded. Solomon was taken to the Gihon spring, where Zadok took the horn of oil from the tabernacle and anointed him as king. The trumpet sounded, and all the people shouted, "Long live King Solomon!" It was a breathtaking scene. 1 Kings 1:40 says the people were playing flutes and rejoicing so loudly that the ground shook with the sound. Meanwhile, Adonijah and his guests were finishing their banquet when they heard the noise from the city. Joab, the seasoned commander, recognized the sound of the trumpets and asked, "Why is the city in such an uproar?" 1 Kings 1:41. Before they could make sense of what was happening, Jonathan, the son of the priest Abiathar, arrived with news. Solomon had been anointed king with David's blessing, and the people were celebrating. Fear gripped Adonijah and his guests. The coup had failed. Everyone got up and left, each to their own home. Fearing for his life, Adonijah ran to the tabernacle and grabbed the horns of the altar, a traditional plea for mercy and sanctuary. In 1 Kings 1:50-51 we read, "Adonijah was afraid of Solomon, so he went and took hold of the horns of the altar. Then Solomon was told, 'Adonijah is afraid of King Solomon and is clinging to the horns of the altar. He says, "Let King Solomon swear to me today that he will not put his servant to death with the sword." Solomon's first act as king was deciding what to do with his rebellious brother. His response revealed both wisdom and mercy. 1 Kings 1:52 records, "If he shows himself to be worthy, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground, but if evil is found in him, he will die." Solomon gave Adonijah a second chance, but with a clear warning. Adonijah was brought before the king, bowed low, and Solomon simply said, "Go home." 1 Kings 1:53. The early days of Solomon's reign were focused on consolidating power. He had to deal not only with Adonijah, but also with others who had supported the rebellion or posed a threat to his rule. After David's death, Adonijah made a dangerous request through Bathsheba. He wanted to marry Abishag, the young woman who had cared for David in his old age. This was seen as a veiled attempt to claim the throne, and Solomon responded decisively. In 1 Kings 2:23-25, he says, "Adonijah has made this request at the cost of his life. As surely as the Lord lives, he who has established me securely on the throne of my father David, and has founded a dynasty for me as he promised, Adonijah shall be put to death today." And so it was. Solomon also removed Abiathar from the priesthood, sending him to his own lands in Anathoth, and ordered the execution of Joab, who had supported Adonijah and was guilty of numerous past crimes. Shimei, the man who had cursed David during Absalom's rebellion, was confined to Jerusalem under strict orders not to leave the city, a command he eventually disobeyed, costing him his life. With his reign now secure, Solomon could turn his attention to governing the nation. He loved the Lord and followed the statutes of his father David, with one exception. He continued to offer sacrifices and burn incense at the high places, since no temple had yet been built for the name of the Lord. One such high place was Gibeon, where the main bronze altar stood. Solomon went there to offer sacrifices to God. 1 Kings 3:4 notes, "The king went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices, for that was the most important high place, and Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar." That night, after offering the 1,000 sacrifices, something extraordinary happened. God appeared to Solomon in a dream. It was rare for God to reveal himself to kings in such a way, but Solomon held a special place in the Lord's heart. In the dream, God made him an astonishing offer. In 1 Kings 3:5, he says, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." It was like a divine blank check. Solomon could have asked for anything: wealth, long life, victory over enemies. But his answer revealed a humble heart and a deep awareness of his responsibilities. First, he acknowledged God's kindness to his father. 1 Kings 3:6 says, "You have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart." Then he expressed gratitude for how God had fulfilled his promise. Still in verse 6, "You have continued this great kindness to him and have given him a son to sit on his throne this very day." Next, Solomon admitted his sense of inadequacy. In 1 Kings 3:7 he says, "Now, Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, but I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties." This wasn't false modesty. Solomon was likely around 20 years old and fully aware of the weight of leading a prosperous and rapidly growing nation. Finally, he made his request, not for himself, but for the good of the people entrusted to him. 1 Kings 3:9 says, "So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?" Solomon's choice pleased the Lord deeply. 1 Kings 3:10 emphasizes, "The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this." God was impressed not only by what Solomon asked for, but by what he didn't ask for. In verse 11 he says, "Since you have asked for this and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice." God's response went far beyond what Solomon could have imagined. In 1 Kings 3:12, "I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be." It was a promise of unprecedented wisdom. Solomon would be the wisest man to ever live, but God didn't stop there. In 1 Kings 3:13 he added, "Moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for, both wealth and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings." And he concluded with a conditional promise in 1 Kings 3:14. "And if you walk in obedience to me and keep my decrees and commands as David your father did, I will give you a long life." When Solomon awoke, he realized it had been a dream, but not an ordinary one. He returned to Jerusalem, stood before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, offered burnt offerings and peace offerings, and held a feast for all his servants. It marked the beginning of a blessed reign. The first signs of Solomon's extraordinary wisdom soon became evident. He displayed an incredible ability to understand human nature, to discern hidden motives, and to come up with creative solutions to complex problems. His insight went beyond academic knowledge. It was a practical wisdom for ruling, judging, and leading. It didn't take long for Solomon's wisdom to be tested in a dramatic and public way. A particularly difficult case reached the royal court, involving 2 women and a baby. The situation was complicated, as we see in 1 Kings 3:16-22. Now 2 prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. One of them said, "Pardon me, my lord. This woman and I live in the same house, and I had a baby while she was there with me. The 3rd day after my child was born, this woman also had a baby. We were alone. There was no one in the house but the 2 of us. During the night, this woman's son died because she lay on him. So she got up in the middle of the night and took my son from my side while I, your servant, was asleep. She put him by her breast and put her dead son by mine. The next morning I got up to nurse my son, and he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning light, I saw that it wasn't the son I had borne." The other woman said, "No, the living one is my son. The dead one is yours." But the first one insisted, "No, the dead one is yours. The living one is mine." And so they argued before the king. It was an extremely difficult case. There were no witnesses, no physical evidence, just one woman's word against the others. Any ordinary judge would have struggled to resolve such a dispute, but Solomon was no ordinary judge. After hearing both women, he summarized the case. 1 Kings 3:23 says, "The king said, 'This one says, my son is alive and your son is dead,' while that one says, 'No, your son is dead and mine is alive.'" Then he made a decision that shocked everyone present. In 1 Kings 3:24-25, he gave the order, "Bring me a sword." So they brought a sword for the king. He then gave an order, "Cut the living child in 2 and give half to one and half to the other." The reaction of the 2 women to Solomon's seemingly harsh order revealed exactly what he needed to know. 1 Kings 3:26 tells us, "The woman whose son was alive was deeply moved out of love for her son and said to the king, 'Please, my lord, give her the living baby. Don't kill him.' But the other said, 'Neither I nor you shall have him. Cut him in 2. In that moment, Solomon knew who the real mother was. His unusual strategy had worked perfectly. He then gave the command in 1 Kings 3:27, "Give the living baby to the first woman. Do not kill him. She is his mother." News of this judgment quickly spread throughout Israel. 1 Kings 3:28 states, "When all Israel heard the verdict the king had given, they held the king in awe because they saw that he had wisdom from God to administer justice." It was a turning point for the young king. His reputation as a wise and just ruler was firmly established. With his authority now solid and his wisdom recognized, Solomon turned to the task of reorganizing the kingdom. Under David's reign, Israel had grown in both territory and population, and the administrative system needed to match this expansion. Solomon implemented innovative reforms that transformed Israel from a collection of tribes into a unified and efficient kingdom. Kings 4:1-6 lists Solomon's top officials. So King Solomon ruled over all Israel, and these were his chief officials: Azariah, son of Zadok, the priest; Elihoreph and Ahijah, sons of Shisha, secretaries; Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, recorder; Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, commander-in-chief; Zadok and Abiathar, priests; Azariah, son of Nathan, in charge of the district governors; Zabud, son of Nathan, a priest and advisor to the king; Ehishar, palace administrator, Adoniram, son of Abda, in charge of forced labor. This structure reflected a clear division of duties, with officials assigned to specific domains such as religion, record-keeping, the military, finance, and palace. Administration. It was a professional and diverse cabinet, chosen for competence rather than just family ties. However, the most significant reorganization came with the division of the kingdom into 12 administrative districts, which didn't necessarily follow traditional tribal boundaries. 1 Kings 4:7 explains, Solomon also had 12 district governors over all Israel who supplied provisions for the king and the royal household. Each one had to provide supplies for 1 month of the year. In the following verses, 1 Kings 4:8-19, we find the list of these 12 districts and their respective governors. This system had multiple purposes. First, it ensured a steady flow of supplies to the royal court, with each district responsible for provisions 1 month per year. Second, it facilitated tax collection and resource distribution. Third, it helped to weaken old tribal loyalties in favor of a unified national identity. 1 Kings 4:22-23 gives us an idea of the scale of these provisions. Solomon's daily provisions were 30 cores of the finest flour and 60 cores of meal, 10 head of stall-fed cattle, 20 of pasture-fed cattle, and 100 sheep and goats, as well as deer, gazelles, roebucks, and choice fowl. These numbers reflect a massive supply, enough to feed thousands of people each day, not just the royal family, but also officials, servants, guards, and guests. Solomon also expanded the national service system. In 1 Kings 5:13-14, we read that he instituted a rotating labor system for large construction projects. King Solomon conscripted laborers from all Israel, 30,000 men. He sent them off to Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 a month, so that they spent 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of the labor force. This allowed for the mobilization of a large workforce without overly burdening the population. Solomon's court became a hub of knowledge and culture, attracting sages and experts from various fields. Kings 4:30-31 tells us, Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the East, and greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone else, and his fame spread to all the surrounding nations. His court welcomed poets, musicians, naturalists, and philosophers, turning Israel into not just a political center, but a cultural one as well. Political and marital alliances were also central to Solomon's strategy. His first major alliance was with Egypt, sealed through marriage to Pharaoh's daughter. 1 Kings 3:1 records, Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. He brought her to the city of David. This was a prestigious alliance, as Egypt was one of the great powers of the time, and it signified Israel's rising status on the international stage. Beyond Egypt, Solomon maintained good relations with many other kingdoms. His most fruitful alliance was with Hiram, king of Tyre, who had been a friend of David. This partnership was crucial for Solomon's construction projects, as we'll see ahead. Under Solomon's effective administration, Israel flourished like never before. Kings 4:20-21 describes this prosperity in vivid terms. The people of Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They ate, they drank, and they were happy. Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates River to the land of the Philistines, as far as the border of Egypt. Solomon transformed a tribal kingdom into a well-organized empire, establishing an administrative system that promoted efficiency, prosperity, and peace. Kings 4:25 summarizes, during Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel lived in safety, everyone under their own vine and under their own fig tree, from Dan to Beersheba. At last, Solomon turned to the task God had specifically reserved for him, building the temple. This was a project that David, his father, had long desired to accomplish but was not permitted to. Still, David didn't remain idle. He made extensive preparations. Chronicles 22:14 records David's words to Solomon. "With great pains I have provided for the house of the Lord 100,000 talents of gold, 1,000,000 talents of silver, and quantities of bronze and iron too great to be weighed, and wood and stone. And you may add to them." David not only gathered materials, but also gave detailed instructions. Chronicles 28:11-12 tells us, "Then David gave his son Solomon the plans for the portico of the temple, its buildings, its storerooms, its upper parts, its inner rooms, and the place of atonement. He gave him the plans of all that the Spirit had put in his mind for the courts of the temple of the Lord." With these preparations in hand, Solomon began the project in the 4th year of his reign. Kings 6:1 states, "In the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. One of his first actions was to strengthen the alliance with Hiram, king of Tyre." Kings 5:2-6 recounts Solomon's message. "You know that because of the wars waged against my father David from all sides, he could not build a temple for the name of the Lord his God until the Lord put his enemies under his feet. But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side, and there is no adversary or disaster. I intend therefore to build a temple for the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord told my father David, your son whom I will put on the throne. In your place will build the temple for my name. So give orders that cedars of Lebanon be cut for me. My men will work with yours, and I will pay you for your men whatever wages you set. You know that we have no one so skilled in felling timber as the Sidonians." Hiram gladly received the message and responded positively. Kings 5:7-9 says, "When Hiram heard Solomon's message, he was greatly pleased and said, 'Praise be to the Lord today, for he has given David a wise son to rule over this great nation.' So Hiram sent word to Solomon, 'I have received the message you sent me and will do all you want in providing the cedar and juniper logs. My men will haul them down from Lebanon to the Mediterranean Sea, and I will float them as rafts by sea to the place you specify. There I will separate them, and you can take them away. You are to grant my wish by providing food for my royal household.' This marked the beginning of a remarkable partnership. Hiram supplied the prized Lebanese wood and skilled workers, while Solomon provided food for the people of Tyre and sent men to help with the logging. Kings 5:10-11 specifies, "In this way, Hiram kept Solomon supplied with all the cedar and juniper logs he wanted, and Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 in cores of wheat as food for his household, and 20 cores of pressed olive oil. Solomon continued to do this for Hiram year after year. With materials arriving and labor organized, construction of the temple could finally begin. It was a grand and detailed project." Kings 6:2-3 gives the basic dimensions. The temple that King Solomon built for the Lord was 60 cubits long, 20 wide, and 30 high. The portico at the front of the main hall of the temple extended the width of the temple, that is, 20 cubits, and projected 10 cubits from the front. These measurements are roughly 27 meters long, 9 meters wide, and 13.5 meters high. The temple's interior was divided into 3 main sections: the portico, the holy place, and the most holy place, or Holy of Holies. The walls were paneled with cedar, and the floors made of cypress planks. Kings 6:15 notes, "He lined its interior walls with cedar boards, paneling them from the floor of the temple to the ceiling, and covered the floor of the temple with planks of juniper." The most holy place, which would house the Ark of the Covenant, received special attention. Kings 6:20 describes it. The inner sanctuary was 20 cubits long, 20 wide and 20 high. He overlaid the inside with pure gold, and he also overlaid the altar of cedar. This space was coated in gold, as were many of the temple's utensils and decorations. A remarkable feature of the construction was the complete absence of noise at the building site. 1 Kings 6:7 explains, "In building the temple, only blocks dressed at the quarry were used, and no hammer, chisel, or any iron tool was heard at the temple site while it was being built." This means the stones were cut and prepared off-site, then brought in ready to be fitted into place. Inside the temple, the decoration was both rich and symbolic. 1 Kings 6:29 describes, "On the walls all around the temple, in both the inner and outer rooms, he carved cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. 2 massive cherub statues, made of olive wood and overlaid with gold, were placed in the most holy place. Their wings stretched out to symbolically cover and protect the Ark of the Covenant. The construction of the temple took 7 years. 1 Kings 6:37-38 records, "The foundation of the temple of the Lord was laid in the 4th year, in the month of Ziv. In the 11th year, in the month of Bul, the 8th month, the temple was finished in all its details according to its specifications. He had spent 7 years building it. When the temple was completed, it was time to move the Ark of the Covenant to its new home. This was a national event, and Solomon summoned all the leaders of Israel to Jerusalem." 1 Kings 8:1 says, "Then King Solomon summoned into his presence at Jerusalem the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes and the chiefs of the Israelite families, to bring up the Ark of the Lord's covenant from Zion, the city of David." The ceremony was carried out with great solemnity. The priests carried the Ark into the temple and placed it in the most holy place beneath the wings of the cherubim. 1 Kings 8-6 records, "The priests then brought the Ark of the Lord's covenant to its place in the inner sanctuary of the temple, the most holy place, and put it beneath the wings of the cherubim." When the priests came out of the holy place, something extraordinary happened. 1 Kings 8:10-11 describes, "When the priests withdrew from the holy place, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord, and the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple." This was the visible manifestation of the divine presence, the Shekinah, the same glorious cloud that had led Israel through the wilderness. Solomon then addressed the people, reminding them of how God had fulfilled his promises to David. He followed with a prayer of dedication, kneeling before the altar of the Lord with his hands stretched toward heaven. It was a comprehensive prayer, asking God to hear the pleas of the people when they turned toward the temple in times of war, drought, famine, sickness, and other hardships. Kings 8:27 contains one of Solomon's most profound declarations. "But will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built?" Solomon acknowledged that although he had built a house for God, the Lord himself was far greater than any physical structure. The dedication ceremony lasted 7 days, followed by the celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles for another 7 days. 2 full weeks of worship and rejoicing. Solomon offered sacrifices in extraordinary numbers. And Kings 8:63 records, "Solomon offered a sacrifice of fellowship offerings to the Lord, 22,000 cattle and 120,000 sheep and goats. So the king and all the Israelites dedicated the temple of the Lord." After the dedication, God appeared to Solomon a second time, just as he had in Gibeon. In 1 Kings 9:3-5, God says, "I have heard the prayer and plea you have made before me. I have consecrated this temple which you have built by putting my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. As for you, if you walk before me faithfully with integrity of heart and uprightness, as David your father did, and do all I command, and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father when I said, you shall never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. While the temple took 7 years to build, Solomon spent 13 years constructing his own palace and other royal buildings. 1 Kings 7:1 records, it took Solomon 13 years, however, to complete the construction of his palace. This does not imply that his palace was more important to him than the temple, but rather that it was a far larger complex with multiple buildings and purposes. The palace complex included several structures: the House of the Forest of Lebanon, likely an arsenal and reception hall; the Hall of Pillars, an audience chamber; the Hall of Justice, where Solomon heard legal cases; and the royal residence itself, which also had a separate palace for Pharaoh's daughter, Solomon's wife. Kings 7:2-5 describes the House of the Forest of Lebanon. He built the palace of the Forest of Lebanon, 100 cubits long, 50 wide and 30 high, with 4 rows of cedar columns supporting trimmed cedar beams. It was roofed with cedar above the beams that rested on the columns, 45 beams, 15 to a row. Its windows were placed high in sets of 3, facing each other. All the doorways had rectangular frames. They were in the front part in sets of 3, facing each other. This impressive structure measured roughly 45 meters long, 22 meters wide, and 13.5 meters high. For these and other projects, Solomon relied on the skill of a craftsman named Hiram, not to be confused with the king of Tyre, who was an expert in working with bronze. Verses Kings 7:13-14 says, King Solomon sent to Tyre and brought Huram, whose mother was a widow from the tribe of Naphtali and whose father was a skilled craftsman in bronze from Tyre. Huram was filled with wisdom, with understanding, and with knowledge to do all kinds of bronze work. He came to King Solomon and did all the work assigned to him. Beyond the palace complex, Solomon also undertook massive infrastructure projects across the kingdom. He developed an elaborate water supply system for Jerusalem, building reservoirs and aqueducts. The largest of these, known as Solomon's Pools, was located near Bethlehem and provided water to both the temple and the city. Solomon also strengthened Israel's defenses by rebuilding walls and fortifications in strategic cities. Kings 9:15 records, this is the account of the forced labor King Solomon conscripted to build the Lord's temple, his own palace, the terraces, the wall of Jerusalem, and Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. These last 3 were key cities in the defense of the kingdom. In addition to reinforcing existing cities, Solomon built new ones with specific purposes. Kings 9:19 mentions, as well as all Solomon's store cities and the towns for his chariots and for his horses, whatever he desired to build in Jerusalem, in Lebanon, and throughout all the territory he ruled. These store cities functioned as storage hubs for food and supplies, which were essential during times of famine or war. One revolutionary aspect of Solomon's reign was his investment in maritime trade. Israel was not traditionally a seafaring nation, but Solomon changed that. Kings 9:26-27 states, King Solomon also built ships at Ezion-Geber, which is near Elath in Edom, on the shore of the Red Sea. And Hiram sent his men, sailors who knew the sea, to serve in the fleet with Solomon's men. These ships embarked on long-distance trade missions, bringing back rare and valuable goods. Kings 10:22 explains, the king had a fleet of trading ships at sea along with the ships of Hiram. Once every 3 years it returned, bringing gold, silver and ivory, and apes and baboons. Tarshish likely refers to a region in modern-day Spain, or possibly Tartessos, an ancient kingdom in the southwest Iberian Peninsula. The most famous of these expeditions was to Ophir, a place whose exact location remains uncertain, though it was likely on the eastern coast of Africa, in Arabia, or even in India. Kings 9:28 says, "They sailed to Ophir and brought back 420 talents of gold, which they delivered to King Solomon." That's an enormous amount, about 15 metric tons of gold by today's standards. All these construction projects and commercial ventures transformed Israel into not only a political and military power, but also an economic one. Wealth poured into the kingdom as never before. Kings 10:14-15 offers a glimpse of the scale of this prosperity. The weight of the gold that Solomon received yearly was 600 to 66 talents, not including the revenues from merchants and traders and from all the Arabian kings and the governors of the territories. Solomon's wisdom, wealth, and achievements became renowned far beyond Israel's borders. His fame spread throughout the known world, drawing not just merchants and artisans, but also dignitaries and rulers who came to see this extraordinary kingdom and its wise king for themselves. The most famous of these visits was by the Queen of Sheba. Sheba was likely a kingdom in southern Arabia, modern-day Yemen, or possibly in the region of Ethiopia. It was a wealthy land, known for trading spices, precious stones, and gold. The queen, whose name isn't mentioned in the Bible, had heard of Solomon's fame and decided to see for herself whether the reports were true. Kings 10:1-2 tells us, "When the Queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon and his relationship to the Lord, she came to test Solomon with hard questions. Arriving at Jerusalem with a very great caravan, with camels carrying spices, large quantities of gold, and precious stones, she came to Solomon and talked with him about all that she had on her mind." Her visit had multiple purposes. First, it was a diplomatic and commercial mission. She likely wanted to establish trade relations with the rising Israelite empire. Second, it was a chance to test Solomon's wisdom by posing riddles or difficult questions. Royal courts in antiquity often engaged in such intellectual duels for both entertainment and the display of power. The queen was not disappointed. Kings 10:3 records, "Solomon answered all her questions. Nothing was too hard for the king to explain to her. He responded to every inquiry, no matter how complex or obscure." But it wasn't just Solomon's wisdom that amazed her. She was also awestruck by everything she saw in Israel. Kings 10:4-5 describes her reaction. "When the Queen of Sheba saw all the wisdom of Solomon and the palace he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his officials, the attending servants in their robes, his cupbearers, and the burnt offerings he made at the temple of the Lord, she was overwhelmed." The phrase, "she was overwhelmed," means she was left breathless, completely astonished. She then made a remarkable statement. In 1 Kings 10:6-9, she says, "The report I heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom is true, but I did not believe these things until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told me. In wisdom and wealth, you have far exceeded the report I heard. How happy your people must be, how happy your officials who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom. Praise be to the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and placed you on the throne of Israel. Because of the Lord's eternal love for Israel, he has made you king to maintain justice and righteousness." This last part of her declaration is especially significant. She acknowledged that the source of Solomon's wisdom and success was the Lord, the God of Israel. While the Bible doesn't explicitly say she converted to the worship of the true God, her words suggest a recognition of the God of Israel's superiority over the gods of her own people. The visit concluded with a remarkable exchange of gifts. Kings 10:10 records, "And she gave the king 120 talents of gold, large quantities of spices, and precious stones. Never again were so many spices brought in as those the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon." In return, 1 Kings 10:13 says, King Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba all she desired and asked for, besides what he had given her out of his royal bounty. Then she left and returned with her retinue to her own country. This exchange laid the foundation for important trade relations between Israel and Sheba. The spices and exotic products the queen brought enriched life in Israel, while Israel's goods and knowledge likely benefited the kingdom of Sheba. The visit of the Queen of Sheba was merely the most famous of many diplomatic visits received by Solomon. 1 Kings 4:34 notes, people from every nation came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom. These visits put Israel on the map as a cultural and political power and helped establish relationships that brought many benefits to the kingdom. Solomon's fame spread so widely that his name became synonymous with wisdom and prosperity throughout the ancient world. His reign brought Israel to the peak of its influence and power, a period remembered as the nation's golden age. Even Jesus, centuries later, would reference this moment. In Matthew 12:42, he says, "The Queen of the South will rise at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for she came from the ends of the earth to listen to Solomon's wisdom, and now something greater than Solomon is here." Thus, the Queen of Sheba's visit became not only a milestone in Israel's history, but also a lasting symbol of the search for wisdom and truth. Yet even at the height of Israel's glory, small cracks were beginning to form in the foundation of Solomon's reign. Like a beautiful house hiding structural flaws, the magnificent kingdom concealed issues that over time would grow and lead to its fall. God had been very clear about the limits an Israelite king was to observe. In Deuteronomy 17:16-17, Moses wrote God's instructions for future kings. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. These weren't arbitrary rules. They were safeguards against three major pitfalls that could lead a king's heart astray: trusting in military strength instead of in God, being led away by foreign wives from true worship, and relying on wealth instead of divine provision. Solomon began to disregard these limits. In 1 Kings 10:26, we see the first departure. Solomon accumulated chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses, which he kept in the chariot cities and also with him in Jerusalem. This was an impressive military force for the time, suggesting that Solomon had begun to place more faith in military might than in divine protection. These chariots and horses weren't just from anywhere. They came precisely from Egypt, the nation from which God had delivered Israel. 1 Kings 10:28-29 says, Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt and from Kue. The royal merchants purchased them from Kue at the current price. They imported a chariot from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver and a horse for 150. They also exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and of the Arameans. In addition to importing horses and chariots from Egypt, Solomon amassed unprecedented wealth. Regular tribute and international trade profits were no longer enough. 1 Kings 10:14-15 highlights the scale of his riches. The weight of the gold that Solomon received yearly was 666 talents, not including the revenues from merchants and traders and from all the Arabian kings and the governors of the land. To put this into perspective, 1 talent of gold weighed about 34 kilograms. Multiplying that by 666, we get over 22 metric tons of gold per year. And that was just a portion of the royal income, excluding commercial profits and other tributes. The wealth was almost incalculable. This wealth led to increasing opulence. Solomon was no longer content with what was adequate. Everything had to be extravagant. In 1 Kings 10:21 we read, "All King Solomon's goblets were gold, and all the household articles in the palace of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Nothing was made of silver, because silver was considered of little value in Solomon's days." Imagine a kingdom where silver was seen as practically worthless. His royal throne was unimaginably lavish. In 1 Kings 10:18-20, we find the description. "Then the king made a great throne, covered with ivory and overlaid with fine gold. The throne had 6 steps, and its back had a rounded top. On both sides of the seat were armrests, with a lion standing beside each of them. 12 lions stood on the 6 steps, one at either end of each step. Nothing like it had ever been made for any other kingdom." All this wealth and splendor came at a cost. To sustain his luxurious lifestyle and numerous building projects, Solomon needed more and more money. The solution? Heavily increased taxes and forced labor imposed on the people. At first, the tax system seemed fair. Each district provided supplies for 1 month per year. But over time, the fiscal demands escalated. 1 Kings 4:7 says, "Solomon had 12 district governors over all Israel, who supplied provisions for the king and the royal household. Each one had to provide supplies for 1 month in the year." Beyond taxation, Solomon implemented a system of forced labor that affected even the Israelites themselves. In 1 Kings 5:13-14 we read, "King Solomon conscripted laborers from all Israel, 30,000 men. He sent them off to Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 a month, so that they spent 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home." Adoniram was in charge of the forced labor. What began as a temporary workforce to build the temple became a permanent system of forced labor for the king's personal projects. This corvée system, mandatory public labor, was precisely the kind of oppression Samuel had warned about in 1 Samuel 8:11-18, when the people first asked for a king. With all this focus on wealth, military strength, and grand projects, Solomon gradually drifted from the law of Moses. Though he maintained religious rituals and ceremonies, his heart began to stray from the deeper principles of the covenant with God. If Solomon's early compromises were relatively subtle, the same can't be said of his royal harem. In this matter, the king blatantly and directly violated divine commandments with disastrous consequences. Forming political alliances through royal marriages was a common practice in the ancient world. A powerful king would seal peace and trade agreements by marrying princesses from neighboring nations. While politically pragmatic, this practice was dangerous for Israel, a nation called to be holy and set apart for God. Solomon adopted this policy early on. His first political marriage was to the daughter of Pharaoh, as we read in 1 Kings 3:1. Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. He brought her to the city of David until he finished building his palace and the temple of the Lord, and the wall around Jerusalem. This marriage, although questionable from a religious standpoint, could at least be justified as a key strategic alliance with the region's dominant power. But Solomon didn't stop there. Over time, his harem grew dramatically, including women from every neighboring nation. In 1 Kings 11:1-3, the Bible describes this shocking situation. King Solomon loved many foreign women, besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, "You must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods." Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. The numbers are staggering: 700 wives and 300 concubines, 1,000 women in total. It was an overwhelmingly large harem, even by the standards of ancient monarchs. And they weren't just ordinary women, the Bible specifies. They were princesses, daughters of kings and nobles from other nations, each bringing not only her beauty and rank, but also her culture and religion. These marital alliances had clear political and economic benefits in the short term. Each new marriage meant a new allied kingdom, new trade routes, and new markets for Israelite goods. But the spiritual cost was immense. The foreign princesses didn't arrive in Jerusalem alone. They came with servants, advisors, priests, and, most dangerously, their gods, each expected to continue worshipping her deity even in a foreign land. And Solomon, instead of insisting that they worship only the God of Israel, began making concessions. The cultural influence of these women at the Jerusalem court must have been enormous. Imagine the royal palace as a cultural melting pot. Languages, customs, clothing, music, cuisine, and sadly, religious practices from dozens of different nations all mingling together. What started as cultural tolerance soon devolved into religious syncretism. The palace, which should have been a beacon of worship to the true God, became a center of religious diversity. Discussions in the halls of power no longer centered solely around the law of Moses, but included debates over the myths and rituals of Baal, Ashtoreth, Chemosh, and many other pagan gods. This erosion of Solomon's spiritual integrity is laid bare in 1 Kings 11:4. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. Note how the Bible specifically mentions, as Solomon grew old. This suggests that for many years the king resisted the religious influence of his wives. Initially, he likely tolerated their practices out of political expedience while keeping his own heart faithful to God. But over time, constant exposure to these influences wore down his faith. The conflict between God's law and Solomon's marriage policy became increasingly undeniable. The law of Moses explicitly forbade intermarriage with the nations of Canaan and their neighbors, precisely to prevent religious seduction. In Deuteronomy 7:3-4, God warned, "Do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods, and the Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you." This is exactly what happened to Solomon. What seemed like brilliant diplomacy proved to be a spiritual disaster. The wisest man in the world fell into the very trap God had so clearly warned against. The influence of Solomon's foreign wives didn't stop at private conversations or personal practices. Over time, what began as cultural tolerance evolved into active support for pagan religions, leading the king into outright apostasy. The Bible describes this tragic transformation in 1 Kings 11:5-8. Solomon followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely, as David his father had done. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. This wasn't just a moment of weakness or a passing error. It was a systematic shift in the kingdom's religious policy. Solomon didn't just permit his wives to worship their gods privately. He built altars and shrines for them on Israelite soil. The gods mentioned here represented some of the most morally corrupt religious practices of the ancient world. Ashtoreth, the fertility goddess of the Sidonians, Phoenicians, was often worshipped through rituals involving sacred prostitution. Molech, or Milcom, the Ammonite god, was worshipped through human sacrifice, particularly the burning of children. Chemosh, The national god of Moab was also linked to human sacrifice and orgiastic rituals. These were not harmless religions or alternative philosophies. They were cults that practiced some of the most cruel and immoral rituals imaginable, abominations in the eyes of God, and completely contrary to everything the law of Moses taught. The location where Solomon built these pagan shrines is significant. The text says he erected an altar to Chemosh on the hill east of Jerusalem. This was likely the Mount of Olives, which lay to the east of the city and was visible from the temple. Picture the scene. On one side of the city, the magnificent temple dedicated to the one true God. On the other, altars to pagan gods, both built by the same king. This blatant contradiction could not be more symbolic of the division within Solomon's own heart. The same man who had built the house of the Lord was now erecting sanctuaries for abominations. The same king who had offered a beautiful prayer at the temple's dedication was now permitting pagan priests to conduct idolatrous rituals in Jerusalem, the holy city. The presence of pagan priests in Jerusalem was a natural consequence of Solomon's religious policies. Each foreign cult required its own specialists, priests trained in their specific rites and traditions. As a result, the city that was meant to be the center of worship for the true God became a religious melting pot where Levitical priests coexisted with priests of Baal, prophets of the Lord with pagan diviners. This situation stood in stark contrast to the monotheistic zeal of David, Solomon's father. Though David committed serious sins, like adultery with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah, he never strayed from exclusive worship of the Lord. In his Psalms, David often expressed contempt for idols and unwavering devotion to the one God of Israel. In Psalm 16:4, for example, David wrote, "The sorrows of those who run after other gods shall multiply. I will not pour out their drink offerings of blood or take their names on my lips." And in Psalm 31:6, "I hate those who pay regard to worthless idols, but I trust in the Lord." This was the spiritual tradition in which Solomon had been raised. His departure from it represented not just a break from the law of Moses, but also from his own father's example. Solomon's support for pagan cults had a corrosive effect on the entire nation. When the king, who was supposed to model faithfulness to God, began to promote idolatry, it sent a clear message that the people were free to do the same. The seeds of national apostasy, which would fully bloom in the reigns that followed, were planted during Solomon's rule. God did not remain silent in the face of Solomon's apostasy. As he always did when his people strayed, he sent messengers to warn, rebuke, and call them to repentance. The Bible doesn't specify which prophet confronted Solomon, but it makes clear that the king received a direct message from God. In 1 Kings 11:9-10, it says, "The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice." Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. Take note, God was especially indignant because he had appeared to Solomon personally, twice. The first time was in Gibeon, early in Solomon's reign, when God granted him unparalleled wisdom. The second was after the dedication of the temple, when God promised to establish Solomon's throne forever on the condition that he walked with integrity, as David had. These weren't vague or indirect instructions. God had spoken to Solomon directly, commanding him not to follow other gods. The king could not plead ignorance or confusion. He knew exactly what God expected and chose to disobey. God's response to Solomon's rebellion was severe, but tempered with mercy for David's sake. In 1 Kings 11:13, God says, "So the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe, for the sake of David my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen." The sentence was clear. The kingdom would be divided. The national unity that had been one of the great accomplishments of David's and Solomon's reigns would be undone. The empire that once stretched from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, would be fractured. Yet even in his anger, God showed mercy in three ways. First, the division would not happen during Solomon's lifetime, sparing him the humiliation of seeing his kingdom fall apart. Second, his son would still retain part of the kingdom, specifically the tribe of Judah. Third, this mercy was not given on Solomon's merit, but for the sake of David and for the sake of Jerusalem. The mention of David is significant. God remembered David's faithfulness despite his sins. While David failed gravely at times, his heart was always directed toward God. He never worshipped other gods, and when confronted with his sin, he showed genuine repentance. The contrast with Solomon could not be more striking. The mention of Jerusalem is also important. The city that David had conquered and Solomon had beautified held a central place in God's plan. It was the site of the temple, the symbol of God's presence among his people. For the sake of this holy city, God would not allow the kingdom to be completely destroyed. The Bible doesn't record Solomon's reaction to this prophetic message. There's no indication that he repented or changed his ways after receiving God's warning. Unlike David, who humbled himself deeply when the prophet Nathan confronted him over his sin with Bathsheba, Solomon appears to have ignored the voice of God. God's sentence against Solomon soon began to manifest in real challenges to his reign. Although the final division of the kingdom would occur after his death, God began raising up adversaries during his lifetime. The Bible mentions three primary opponents: Hadad the Edomite, Rezon son of Eliada, and Jeroboam son of Nebat. The first two were external threats, but the third represented internal rebellion, far more dangerous to the future of the kingdom. Hadad was a prince of Edom who had escaped to Egypt when David conquered his land. In 1 Kings 11:14-22, we read his story. The Lord raised up an adversary against Solomon, Hadad the Edomite, from the royal line of Edom. The passage recounts how Hadad, still a child at the time, fled to Egypt with some of his father's servants when Joab, David's general, killed all the men in Edom. In Egypt, Hadad grew up under the protection of Pharaoh, married the king's sister-in-law, and had a son who was raised in the royal palace. When Hadad learned of the deaths of David and Joab, he asked Pharaoh for permission to return to his homeland. Though the text doesn't go into detail about his actions upon returning, the final line is telling. This is the trouble Hadad caused. He loathed Israel and reigned over Aram. He became a persistent enemy, likely leading border raids and disrupting trade routes in the south. The second adversary was Rezon, a former servant of Hadadezer, king of Zobah, whom David had defeated. In 1 Kings 11:23-25 we read, God also raised up another adversary against Solomon, Rezon, son of Eliada, who had fled from his master Hadadezer, king of Zobah. He gathered men around him and became the leader of a band of rebels. When David destroyed the forces of Hadadezer, Rezon and his men fled to Damascus, where they settled and took control. Rezon was Israel's adversary as long as Solomon lived, adding to the trouble caused by Hadad. Rezon established a hostile kingdom in Damascus, controlling Israel's northern border and likely interfering with trade routes in that region. With enemies pressing in from both the north and south, the freedom of movement that Israel had enjoyed during the height of Solomon's reign was steadily shrinking. But the greatest threat came from within the kingdom itself, through Jeroboam, son of Nebat. In 1 Kings 11:26-28, the Bible introduces him this way. Also, Jeroboam, son of Nebat, rebelled against the king. He was one of Solomon's officials, an Ephraimite from Zeredah, and his mother was a widow named Zeruiah. Here is the account of how he rebelled against the king. Solomon had built the terraces and had filled in the gap in the wall of the city of David his father. Now Jeroboam was a man of standing, and when Solomon saw how well the young man did his work, he put him in charge of the whole labor force of the tribes of Joseph. Jeroboam was a skilled official whom Solomon promoted to oversee forced labor. From the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, the house of Joseph, he was described as a man of standing and industrious, qualities that had drawn the king's favor. But eventually, Jeroboam lifted his hand against the king, a phrase implying rebellion. The turning point in Jeroboam's life came when he encountered the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite. In 1 Kings 11:29-31, we read, "About that time, Jeroboam was going out of Jerusalem, and Ahijah the prophet of Shiloh met him on the way, wearing a new cloak. The two of them were alone in the open country. Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. Then he said to Jeroboam, 'Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes.'" The symbolism was clear. The new cloak represented the United Kingdom of Israel, and the 12 pieces stood for the 12 tribes. 10 pieces, representing 10 tribes, would be given to Jeroboam. The remaining 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, would stay with Solomon's son. Ahijah explained that this division would happen because of Solomon's idolatry. In 1 Kings 11:33, God says, "I will do this because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Molech, the god of the Ammonites, and have not walked in my ways, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my statutes and laws as David, Solomon's father, did." Yet just as he had done with Solomon, God offered Jeroboam a conditional promise. In 1 Kings 11:37-38 we read, "However, as for you, I will take you, and you will rule over all that your heart desires. You will be king over Israel. If you do whatever I command you, and walk in obedience to me, and do what is right in my eyes by obeying my decrees and commands, as David my servant did, I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David, and will give Israel to you." It was an extraordinary opportunity. If Jeroboam remained faithful to God, he would receive the same kind of enduring blessing promised to David's lineage. Sadly, as we'll see later, Jeroboam would fail this test as well. Somehow, Solomon learned of the prophecy and tried to have Jeroboam killed. In 1 Kings 11:40 we read, "Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam fled to Egypt, to Shishak the king, and stayed there until Solomon's death." Solomon's attempt to kill Jeroboam shows how far he had drifted from the ideals of his early reign. The young king who had once asked for wisdom to rule justly was now prepared to murder a subject over a prophecy. And it's worth noting that Jeroboam fled to Egypt, to the court of Shishak, a new pharaoh who no longer shared the friendly relations with Israel that his predecessor had maintained. The irony is striking. The same nations Solomon had allied with through marriage were now becoming sanctuaries for his enemies. Egypt, whose pharaoh had given his daughter in marriage to Solomon, was now harboring Jeroboam, his future rival. Edom, once conquered by David, was now ruled by Hadad, who loathed Israel. The northern border, once secure at the peak of Solomon's power, was now threatened by Rezon in Damascus. Despite all his wisdom, Solomon seemed blind to the dangers that his own actions posed to the future of his kingdom. His attempt to eliminate Jeroboam only reinforced the prophecy, pushing his rival into a safe haven where he could wait for the right moment to return. As his reign progressed, Solomon became increasingly obsessed with massive construction projects. The temple and royal palace were already complete, but he continued to undertake grand works across the kingdom, largely for his own glorification. In 1 Kings 9:15, we read about some of these projects. Here is the account of the forced labor. King Solomon conscripted to build the Lord's temple, his own palace, the terraces, the wall of Jerusalem, and Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. Millo was part of the fortification of Jerusalem, possibly an embankment that filled the valley between the city of David and the Temple Mount. In addition to strengthening the capital, Solomon also rebuilt and fortified several strategic cities throughout the kingdom, including Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer, which controlled key trade and military routes. The list of projects continues in 1 Kings 9:17-19. So Solomon rebuilt Gezer, Lower Beth-horon, Baalath, and Tadmor in the wilderness, in the land of Judah, as well as all the store cities that Solomon had, and the cities for his chariots and for his horsemen, and whatever Solomon desired to build in Jerusalem, in Lebanon, and throughout all the land of his dominion. These projects served military, economic, and administrative purposes. The store cities were used to stockpile supplies and resources, the chariot cities housed war chariot garrisons, and the horsemen cities served as bases for the cavalry. But there was also a clear element of ostentation and personal glorification, especially with the buildings in Jerusalem and Lebanon, where Solomon maintained summer residences. To carry out these vast projects, Solomon needed a massive labor force. Initially, he relied primarily on foreign laborers for major undertakings such as the temple and the palace. In 1 Kings 9:20-22 we read, "All the people who were left of the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, who were not Israelites, their descendants who remained in the land, those whom the Israelites could not completely destroy, Solomon conscripted for forced labor to this day. But Solomon did not make slaves of the Israelites. They were his soldiers, officials, commanders, captains, and chariot and cavalry officers." However, as the number of projects increased, this policy began to shift. Solomon eventually imposed forced labor on the Israelites as well. In 1 Kings 5:13-14, previously mentioned, we see that he conscripted 30,000 men from Israel to work in Lebanon on a rotating basis. This system of corvée labor became increasingly heavy and oppressive. In 1 Kings 12:4, when the people approach Rehoboam after Solomon's death, they plead, "Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." This reference to a heavy yoke indicates that forced labor had become extremely burdensome in the final years of Solomon's reign. The corvée was not just physically exhausting, it was socially disruptive. Recruited men had to leave their families and land for a month at a time, which negatively impacted agriculture and community life. Although the rotation system allowed them to spend 2 months at home, it still represented a major interruption to daily living. In addition, the increased taxation required to fund these projects placed an extra economic burden on the people. The wealth that had once flowed into Israel through trade was now being funneled into royal coffers and spent on increasingly extravagant works that primarily served to glorify the king. This situation began to deepen the socio-economic divide. In the kingdom, on one side was the Jerusalem elite, government officials, military officers, wealthy merchants, and temple priests who benefited from Solomon's policies. On the other side were commoners and peasants, especially from the northern tribes, who bore the brunt of taxation and forced labor. Resentment towards Solomon's grandiose projects was silently growing. The Israelites, having once been slaves in Egypt, found the imposition of forced labor by their own king a painful reminder of that traumatic past. This was exactly the kind of oppression that Samuel had warned about in 1 Samuel 8:11-17, when the people first demanded a monarch. The tribe of Ephraim in particular had a long-standing history of resisting centralized power. It was the tribe of Joshua, and one of the most powerful in the north. It's no coincidence that Jeroboam, the future leader of the rebellion, was an Ephraimite, and that Solomon had appointed him over the entire labor force of the house of Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh. By putting Jeroboam in charge of the forced labor among the northern tribes, Solomon unwittingly positioned his future rival right where he could witness firsthand the people's suffering and resentment toward the crown. Jeroboam likely came to be seen as a champion of northern interests, standing in opposition to the Davidic dynasty centered in Judah and Jerusalem. Thus, the seeds of future rebellion were sown in the final years of Solomon's reign. The magnificent kingdom he had inherited from his father David and expanded through wisdom in his early years was now showing cracks that would soon lead to permanent division. The fact that Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam shows just how far he had strayed from his original ideals. The young king who had once asked for wisdom to govern justly was now willing to murder a subject over a prophecy. And it's telling that Jeroboam fled to Egypt to the court of Shishak, a new pharaoh who did not maintain the friendly ties with Israel that his predecessor had. The irony here is striking. The very nations Solomon had allied with through marriage were now becoming refugees for his enemies. Egypt, whose pharaoh had once given his daughter to Solomon in marriage, now harbored Jeroboam, his future adversary. Edom, once conquered by David, was now ruled by Hadad, who hated Israel. The northern border, once secure during Solomon's golden years, was now under threat from Rezon in Damascus. Despite all his wisdom, Solomon seemed blind to the consequences of his own actions. His attempt to eliminate Jeroboam only served to fulfill the prophecy, sending his rival into safe exile where he could bide his time. It's a powerful lesson. Even the wisest and most powerful king cannot stand against God's purposes. As the proverb attributed to Solomon himself says in Proverbs 21:30, there is no wisdom, no insight, no plan that can succeed against the Lord. As his reign progressed, Solomon appeared increasingly obsessed with grand construction projects. The temple and the royal palace had already been completed, but he continued to undertake monumental works throughout the kingdom, largely for his own glorification. In 1 Kings 9:15, we read about some of these constructions. Here is the account of the forced labor King Solomon conscripted to build the Lord's temple, his own palace, the terraces, the wall of Jerusalem, and Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. The Millo was part of Jerusalem's fortifications, possibly an embankment that filled the valley between the city of David and the Temple Mount. In addition to strengthening the capital, Solomon rebuilt and fortified several strategic cities across the kingdom, including Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer, which controlled vital trade and military routes. The list of projects continues in 1 Kings 9:17-19. So Solomon rebuilt Gezer, Lower Beth Horon, Baalath, and Tadmor in the desert within his land, as well as all his store cities and the towns for his chariots and for his horses, whatever he desired to build in Jerusalem, in Lebanon, and throughout all the territory he ruled. These projects served military, economic, and administrative purposes. The store cities were used to stockpile supplies and resources. The chariot towns housed war chariots and their garrisons, and the horse towns served as bases for cavalry units. However, there was also an element of display and personal glorification in these works, especially in Jerusalem and Lebanon, where Solomon had summer residences. To accomplish all these projects, Solomon required a massive workforce. Initially, he primarily employed foreign laborers for major works like the temple and the palace. In 1 Kings 9:20-22 we read, "All the people who were left of the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, these peoples were not Israelites. Solomon conscripted the descendants of all these remaining peoples still in the land, whom the Israelites could not exterminate, to serve as slave labor, as it is to this day." But Solomon did not make slaves of any of the Israelites. They were his fighting men, his government officials, his officers, his captains, and the commanders of his chariots and charioteers. However, as the number of projects increased, this policy changed. Solomon began conscripting Israelites as well. In 1 Kings 5:13-14, previously mentioned, we see that he recruited 30,000 men from Israel to work in Lebanon on a rotating basis. This system of corvée, or forced labor, became increasingly burdensome and oppressive. In 1 Kings 12:4, when the people approach Rehoboam after Solomon's death, they say, "Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." This reference to the heavy yoke suggests that forced labor had become extremely severe in Solomon's later years. Corvée labor was not only physically exhausting, but also socially disruptive. The men conscripted had to leave their families and lands for 1 month, which negatively impacted agriculture and community life. Even though the rotation system allowed them to be home for 2 months, it still meant a significant interruption to daily life. Moreover, rising taxes to fund these projects imposed an additional economic burden on the people. Wealth that once flowed into Israel through trade was now funneled into the royal treasury and spent on increasingly grandiose projects that mainly served to glorify the king. This situation led to a growing socio-economic divide in the kingdom. On one side was the Jerusalem elite, government officials, military officers, wealthy merchants, and temple priests who benefited from Solomon's policies. On the other side were the peasants and common laborers, especially in the northern tribes, who bore the brunt of the taxes and forced labor. Resentment towards Solomon's pharaonic projects was quietly building. As the Israelites had once been slaves in Egypt, the imposition of forced labor by their own king painfully echoed that traumatic experience. It was precisely the kind of oppression Samuel had warned about in 1 Samuel 8:11-17, when the people first asked for a king. The tribe of Ephraim, in particular, had a long history of resisting centralized power. It was Joshua's tribe and one of the most powerful in the north. It's no coincidence that Jeroboam, the future leader of the rebellion, was an Ephraimite and had been appointed by Solomon to oversee the whole labor force of the house of Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh. By appointing Jeroboam to supervise the forced labor in the northern tribes, Solomon inadvertently placed his future rival in a position to witness firsthand the people's suffering and their growing resentment. Toward the crown, Jeroboam likely came to be seen as a defender of the northern tribes' interests against the Davidic dynasty centered in Judah and Jerusalem. Thus, the seeds of the future rebellion were sown in the final years of Solomon's reign. The magnificent kingdom he had inherited from his father, David, and expanded through wisdom in his early years, was now beginning to show cracks that would soon result in a permanent division. As Solomon grew older, his outlook on life and the world seemed to darken and become increasingly disillusioned. The man who had begun his reign full of ideals and enthusiasm now viewed existence through a lens of disenchantment. This transformation is powerfully captured in the book of Ecclesiastes, traditionally attributed to Solomon. The author identifies himself as the preacher son of David, king in Jerusalem, Ecclesiastes 1:1, a description that aligns perfectly with Solomon. The central theme of Ecclesiastes is the vanity or futility of all human life. The Hebrew word used is hebel, which literally means vapor or breath, something fleeting and insubstantial. Right at the beginning of the book, in Ecclesiastes 1:2, the preacher declares, "Vanity of vanities," says the preacher, "vanity of vanities. All is vanity." The book goes on to offer a series of reflections on various aspects of human experience: wisdom, pleasure, work, wealth, power, repeatedly concluding that none of these provide lasting satisfaction or true meaning. In Ecclesiastes 2:4-11, the author describes his great undertakings in a passage that seems to directly reflect Solomon's experience. "I made great works. I built myself houses and planted vineyards. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delights of the sons of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also, my wisdom remained with me. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my labor. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. This passage perfectly captures Solomon's trajectory. A king who had constructed magnificent buildings, cultivated luxurious gardens, amassed immense wealth, and enjoyed every pleasure the world had to offer, only to discover, in the end, that none of it brought lasting fulfillment. The contrast between the youthful zeal of Solomon and the disillusionment of his old age is striking. The young king who once asked God for wisdom to better serve his people now questioned the value of wisdom itself. In Ecclesiastes 1:17-18 he writes, "And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceived that this also is but a striving after wind, for in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow." Perhaps the saddest aspect of Solomon's transformation is his apparent inability to find comfort or guidance in his relationship with God. Unlike David's Psalms, which often express anguish but always return to trust in the Lord, Ecclesiastes rarely mentions a personal connection with God as a source of meaning or hope. When the author finally reaches some form of conclusion in Ecclesiastes 12:13-14, it sounds more like resignation than a vibrant expression of faith. The end of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. This pessimistic outlook stands in stark contrast to the early Solomon, who had once spoken with great enthusiasm about God's goodness and his faithfulness to David's promises. In his later years, he seems to have become a bitter man, looking back on his accomplishments, the magnificent temple, the splendid palace, the fortified cities, the vast wealth, and seeing nothing but vanity and a striving after wind. It's hard not to see in this transformation the impact of Solomon's spiritual choices. By dividing his devotion between the true God and pagan idols, he had lost the firm foundation that gave life meaning and purpose. His wisdom, once directed towards serving God and his people, now spun in sterile circles of analysis and despair. Yet, there is a brutal honesty in Ecclesiastes that continues to resonate with readers across all generations. Solomon doesn't try to hide his disillusionment or sugarcoat his experience. He openly admits that despite having tasted everything life could offer, he found no lasting satisfaction. Paradoxically, this honesty about the emptiness of life without God can be seen as Solomon's final and deepest exercise of wisdom. After seeking meaning in every possible direction, knowledge, pleasure, achievements, wealth, power, he confesses that none of it is enough. This realization, though bitter, might be the first step back toward true wisdom, which begins with the fear of the Lord. So even in his disillusionment, Solomon offers a profound lesson. Not even the wisest, richest, and most powerful king to ever live could find true meaning apart from God. It's a lesson he learned the hard way, and one he left as a legacy for future generations. After a long reign of 40 years, Solomon's life came to an end. The Bible records this moment with simplicity in 1 Kings 11:41-43. Now the rest of the acts of Solomon, and all that he did, and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the Acts of Solomon? And the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. And Solomon slept with his fathers, and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son reigned in his place. There's no mention of repentance or reconciliation with God in Solomon's final days. Unlike David, who gave specific instructions to his successor and spoke of his trust in God's faithfulness, Solomon seems to have departed in silence. The Bible doesn't record his final words or any spiritual preparations for his death. With Solomon's death, the crown passed to his son Rehoboam. It was a moment of truth for the kingdom. The long-predicted division was about to unfold, and the tensions that had built up over decades were about to erupt. Rehoboam faced his first major test when the people, led by Jeroboam, who had returned from Egypt after Solomon's death, came to request relief from the heavy burdens imposed by the former king. In 1 Kings 12:3-4 we read, "So they sent for him, and Jeroboam and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam and said to him, 'Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you.'" It was a pivotal moment. Rehoboam had the chance to listen to the cry of the people and ease the taxes and forced labor, potentially restoring the loyalty of the northern tribes. Instead, he made a fatal mistake by rejecting the advice of the elders who had served his father and following the counsel of the young men he had grown up with. In 1 Kings 12:13-14, we see his disastrous response. The king answered the people harshly. Rejecting the advice given him by the elders, he followed the advice of the young men and said, "My father made your yoke heavy. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." Rehoboam's threat was the last straw. The northern tribes, long resentful of the Davidic dynasty's dominance centered in Judah, immediately rebelled. In 1 Kings 12:16 they declared, "What share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, Israel. Look after your own house, David." So the Israelites went home. When Rehoboam sent Adoniram, the overseer of forced labor, to negotiate, the people stoned him to death. The king barely escaped to Jerusalem, and just like that, in a single day, the magnificent united kingdom that David and Solomon had built was split in two. Israel in the north, 10 tribes, and Judah in the south, the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, along with some Levites. Jeroboam was proclaimed king of Israel, and his first move was to establish golden calf worship in Dan and Bethel, so the people wouldn't travel to Jerusalem to worship, fearing they might return their allegiance to the house of David. Thus, the idolatry that began with Solomon became institutionalized in the northern kingdom, sowing the seeds of its eventual downfall. Solomon's legacy is profoundly ambiguous. On one hand, he was one of Israel's greatest kings, responsible for bringing the nation to the height of its power, wealth, and international prestige. He built the temple, expanded the borders, established lucrative trade routes, and was renowned for his extraordinary wisdom. On the other hand, his policies, and especially his spiritual compromise through idolatry, directly led to the division of the kingdom and the gradual weakening of Israel. The nation that had once been a regional powerhouse under his rule would never again regain the same unity, strength, or influence. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of Solomon's legacy is that he did exactly what he warned others not to do. In Proverbs 4:23, he wrote, "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." Yet he himself failed to guard his heart against the corrosive influence of idolatry and materialism. In Proverbs 14:12, he warned, "There is a way that appears to be right, but in the end it leads to death." That became his own story. The path that seemed to bring political advantage and personal pleasure ultimately led to the kingdom's division and his own spiritual downfall. That's why Solomon's story continues to serve as a powerful warning. For every generation, even the wisest man in the world can be led astray if he fails to remain vigilant and faithful to God. As he himself wrote in Proverbs 16:18, "Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall." Solomon's fall wasn't sudden or dramatic like that of other biblical figures. It was a slow, almost imperceptible decline, made up of small compromises that gradually drew him away from the God who had appeared to him twice and granted him unmatched wisdom. His story reminds us that no amount of knowledge, wealth, or power can replace faithfulness to God. The man who once asked for a discerning heart ended up with a divided heart, and the consequences affected not only him, but the entire nation he was called to lead. If you enjoyed this Bible story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss our next videos. Share it with friends and family who might benefit from the powerful lessons in Solomon's life. Leave a comment below sharing which part of this story touched your heart the most. Your participation means a lot to us. See you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring the incredible stories of the Bible and the lessons they hold for our lives today.